Listen to a lecture in an American history class. The professor is talking about the first transcontinental railroad.
This week, we'll be discussing the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the effects the railroad had on the United States. Today, we will focus on the tremendous financial difficulties of building the railroad, and on Wednesday, we'll look at the influence that the railroad companies had on immigration to the United States. Several transcontinental railroads were completed in the late 1800s. This particular transcontinental railroad was constructed by two companies. The Union Pacific began laying track in the east and headed west, while the Central Pacific began construction in the west and headed east. The two railroads met in Promontory, Utah, and the first transcontinental track was completed on May 10, 1869. The most difficult task for both companies in building the Transcontinental Railroad was funding. The railroad would cost over $100 million, almost twice as much as the federal budget at the time. This was truly an astronomical project. Now we're going to look at a number of issues surrounding the funding of the Transcontinental Railroad. Although some federal funds were granted through the Railroad Act, the federal government could not afford to fund the entire project. Most investors were not interested in investing in the railroads because railroads involved high risks. To raise funds for the railroads, railroad companies began developing businesses dependent on the railroad. The railroad companies spent thousands of dollars to attract businessmen, farmers, craftsmen, and others to the West, and then forced them to pay outrageous prices for the use of the railroad. This scheme helped get the railroads underway. Federal loans, scarce investors, and high fares still did not generate enough funds to complete the track. Because they were desperate and greedy, both the Union Pacific and Central Pacific turned to increasingly unethical means of obtaining funds. One of the most infamous was the Central Pacific's successful relocation of the Sierras. Because federal loans paid triple the money for tracks laid on mountainous terrain, Central Pacific hired a geologist who would misrepresent the location of the Sierra Mountains. President Lincoln accepted this inaccurate topographical report and agreed to pay $48,000 instead of $16,000 per mile for 24 miles of flat land outside of Sacramento, California. The success of this move led to more obviously unethical ventures that not only funded the railroad, but also made the railroad's stockholders quite wealthy. Ultimately, the United States Congress investigated most of the large railroad companies, beginning with the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads. Few people, however, ended up being indicted. From this lecture, I hope that you understand the importance of the history and development of the first transcontinental railroad. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, as well as the scandals involved, were quite remarkable and had a profound influence on the history of the United States. That's all for today. On Wednesday, we will discuss the mass immigration promoted by the railroad companies. Please read about this in Chapter 10 of the text before the next class.
What major problem in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad does the lecture mainly discuss? Identify the railroad track that is most likely the first transcontinental railroad. Why couldn't the federal government completely fund the construction of the railroad? Why did the railroad companies spend thousands of dollars developing businesses out west when they lacked financial resources to build the track? What incorrect information did the railroad companies use to get more money than they should have from the government? The professor mentions several categories of raising funds and provides examples of these categories. Match the examples to the categories.